All right, so we've got these two interviews you sent over. One with Jaya, she's a sex and relationship expert, and then another with Kate Moyle, she's a sex and relationship therapist. And they both go deep, really deep into like all the complicated stuff about sex and relationships, which, let's be real, it can be a lot sometimes.
Totally. And what's so interesting is how both of them really push back against this idea that there's one right way to have good sex.
Yeah.
They talk about how all these expectations we pick up from society, they actually end up making us feel like we're not good enough or like we should be doing things differently.
Oh, 100%. It's like we're all given this script to follow, but no one ever tells you what to do if things go off script, which they always do.
For sure. And then we end up looking for answers in the wrong places, like porn, which Kate actually compares to, get this, learning to drive from watching The Fast and the Furious.
Okay, that is both hilarious and kind of scary at the same time. But okay, so if we're all trapped in these scripts, how do we break free and figure out what actually works for us?
Well, Jaya has this really cool concept called erotic blueprints, and it's all about understanding your own personal, unique way of experiencing desire.
Erotic blueprints. I've never heard of that before.
Basically, there are 5 different blueprints, each representing a different way people experience eroticism. And here's the thing, you and your partner, you might have different blueprints.
Okay, now I have to know what these blueprints are.
All right, so there are the energetics. They get off on anticipation, like the buildup, the energy exchange. It's wild. They can actually have an orgasm without even being touched.
Whoa, seriously. That's next level stuff. It really shows you how powerful the mind-body connection can be.
Right. Then you've got the sensuals. They're all about setting the mood. Think candles, music, soft textures. For them, it's about igniting all those senses.
Makes sense. So what about the people who are like really into the physical act of sex itself?
Jaya calls them the sexuals, and she makes it clear there's nothing wrong with that. It's totally fine to enjoy intercourse and that physical pleasure, but it's when that becomes the only blueprint we recognize, that's when things can get a little, one-dimensional.
Right. It's like there's this whole spectrum of erotic possibility out there.
Exactly. And speaking of exploring those possibilities, we've got the kinky blueprint. So this is about like taboo desires, finding excitement in things like power dynamics, pushing boundaries and really owning what turns you on, even if it's outside of what society says is normal.
And that's where being able to talk to your partner about all this stuff becomes so important, right? Because how can you explore those desires if you're too scared to even say them out loud?
Yeah, totally. And Jaya really emphasizes how important it is to create a space where you feel completely safe and accepted no matter what.
So we've got energetics, sensuals, sexuals, kinky. What's the last blueprint?
The shapeshifters. They're like a mix of all the other blueprints, which makes them super adaptable partners. But it's important, especially for them, to know themselves well and stay true to their own needs and desires.
That makes sense. It's like having all these different tools in your erotic toolbox, but you need to know how to use them.
Exactly. And once you understand your own erotic blueprint, and your partner's too, it can change everything. You start to understand each other better, there's less room for misunderstandings, and you can actually use your differences to grow closer and have more fun together.
So instead of seeing those differences as a bad thing, it's about celebrating them.
Yes, because there's no one right way to experience desire. Everyone's different, and that's what makes things interesting.
I love that.
Okay.
So if you're listening right now and thinking, okay, how do I figure out my erotic blueprint? Don't worry, we've got you covered. Jaya actually has a bunch of resources on her website, so we'll be sure to link to those in the show notes.
Definitely check those out. And remember, this isn't about like labeling yourself or anything. It's about understanding yourself better and using that knowledge to bring more pleasure and intimacy into your life.
So it's not about putting yourself in a box. It's about figuring out what lights you up.
Exactly. And speaking of things that light us up, or maybe sometimes don't light us up, both Jaya and Kate talk about a pretty common issue, especially in long-term relationships, that dreaded dip in libido.
Oh yeah, the what happened to our sex life conversation. It could be such a buzzkill.
Totally. And it's so easy to start overthinking things like, are we having enough sex? Is something wrong with me? Is something wrong with us?
Right. And it's like, once you start keeping track of how often you're doing it, it's game over.
And Kate points out these societal expectations about desire, about how much sex we should be having, they're just not realistic.
So it's normal for desire to go up and down.
Absolutely. Think about it. Our jobs, our stress levels, our hormones, All of that plays a role in how we're feeling, including how much we want to get it on.
Okay, that makes me feel so much better.
Right. And instead of seeing these fluctuations as a problem that needs to be fixed, what if we could shift our perspective and embrace them as a natural part of the journey?
I love that. It's like we get so caught up in trying to get to the goal of sex that we forget to enjoy the journey itself.
Exactly. It's not just about getting to the finish line. It's about enjoying every step along the way.
This is seriously blowing my mind. It's totally changing how I view sex and intimacy. It's not about checking off boxes or meeting some arbitrary quota. It's about cultivating pleasure and connection in all its forms.
You got it. And that's where things get really interesting, because when we shift our focus from performance to pleasure, a whole new world of possibilities opens up.
Okay, now I'm really curious. So how do we cultivate more pleasure in our lives and relationships?
Well, both Jaya and Kate emphasize the importance of communication, but it's not just about talking about sex. It's about creating a safe space where you can really open up to each other, talk about your desires, your fears, your vulnerabilities, all of it.
Easier said than done.
Right.
Like even talking about sex with a long-term partner can be, well, awkward.
You're telling me. But don't worry, both experts have some great advice on how to have those conversations more easily and with more confidence.
Okay, I definitely need to hear this. So any practical tips on how to actually talk about sex without it turning into a complete disaster?
Well, for starters,
Kate suggests leading with positives. Like instead of saying, I don't like it when you, try saying, I love it when you, and then go from there. It just shifts the whole vibe, from criticism to like appreciation.
so much better, right?
Yeah.
Because, who wants to feel attacked or blamed when it comes to something as personal as sex?
Right. It's supposed to be fun. And speaking of feeling safe and comfortable, Jaya actually brings up this really cool concept called dyads.
Naiads, yeah.
You heard of this? I'm not sure I have.
Okay, so basically it's these structured communication exercises, but like they're designed to help you and your partner connect on a deeper level and understand each other's like inner world when it comes to intimacy and stuff.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. How do they actually work?
So imagine this. You're sitting down with your partner and you're taking turns finishing this sentence. Tell me something about your sexuality that you want me to understand.
Whoa. Okay, that's like powerful. It's basically a recipe for vulnerability,
Yeah.
right? Which can be a little scary, but also super important in a relationship.
Exactly. And the best part about dyads is that they give you a framework for having these kinds of conversations. So if you're someone who's like, I don't even know where to start, or what if I say the wrong thing?
Yeah.
This can really help.
Takes the pressure off a bit. So we've talked about being open and honest with each other, but what about when there's a specific issue in the bedroom? Like maybe you have different libidos or your desires don't quite match up. How do you even begin to talk about that kind of stuff without feeling like you're going to hurt your partner's feelings?
Oh, those are such good questions. And honestly, ones that come up all the time. It can be tough. But one thing that both Jaya and Kate emphasize is that starting with curiosity, not blame, is key.
Curiosity.
Okay, like instead of saying, why don't we have sex more often? Try something like, hey, I've noticed we haven't been as intimate lately. I'm curious about what's been going on for you.
It sounds so much less like accusatory, right?
Right, you're basically saying, I'm here to listen and understand, not you're doing something wrong.
Makes a huge difference. And, Kate mentioned something else I thought was interesting. She had this client who, get this, had been dating someone for a whole year. And they had never actually talked about their sexual preferences. Wait, seriously?
Yeah.
A year? That just seems wild to me.
I know, right? But it actually happens more often than you think. And it shows you how easy it is for these communication breakdowns to happen, even when everything else in the relationship seems great.
So what's holding people back from having these conversations?
Well, a lot of it comes down to fear. Fear of being judged, fear of rejection. We're afraid of hurting our partner's feelings, of starting a fight, you name it.
Totally. It feels so much easier to just avoid it altogether.
I get it.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Jaya actually talks about how avoiding those difficult conversations often makes things worse in the long run.
How so?
Well, when we don't talk about stuff, it can create resentment. It can lead to feeling disconnected from your partner, and that can really impact intimacy. And not just sexual intimacy, but emotional intimacy too.
So what's the alternative? If avoiding it is a bad idea, how do you actually bridge that communication gap? Especially when talking about sex can feel about as comfortable as like getting a root canal or something.
Okay, so remember those dyads we talked about earlier?
Yeah, the tell me something you want me to understand exercise.
Exactly. Jaya actually gives that example as a really great starting point for a conversation about sex. It's a gentle way to open the door. you
Oh,
know?
I like that. It's like you're basically saying, hey, I'm curious about you and your sexuality. No judgment here.
Exactly. And Kate actually builds on that by saying that focusing on what is working rather than what's not working can be really helpful.
So instead of starting the conversation with a complaint, like we never have sex anymore, you could say something like,
Exactly. Like, you know what I really
Yeah.
love? When we, and you fill in the blank with something you genuinely enjoy about your intimate life.
okay, that's a really good tip. It's such a simple shift, but I can see how it would completely change the tone of the conversation.
Totally. Because it's about approaching the conversation from a place of appreciation and connection rather than complaint or criticism.
It's like even just acknowledging and appreciating those positive aspects
Right.
can totally shift the energy, right?
For sure. And it can pave the way for a more constructive conversation about the things you want to change or explore together.
This is giving me so much to think about. It's so easy to get caught up in what's not working that we forget to appreciate and acknowledge what is.
So true. But sometimes just remembering those good moments can make all the difference.
So we've talked a lot about the importance of communication. But what about those times when you feel like you've tried everything, you've talked and talked, but things still feel off? Like something's just missing in the bedroom.
Yeah, those ruts happen. So when you're feeling stuck, that's where this idea of a pleasure practice can be super helpful.
Okay, remind me again, what is a pleasure practice exactly?
It's about intentionally bringing more pleasure into your daily life. And no, it doesn't have to be anything complicated or time-consuming. It could be as simple as like taking a long bath, listening to music that makes you feel good, or trying that crevice masturbation technique we talked about earlier.
Because pleasure isn't just about sex.
Yeah.
It's about cultivating that sense of joy and aliveness in all areas of your life.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that pleasure is a birthright. We don't have to earn it or wait for permission to experience it. It's something that we're wired for, and it's something that we deserve to experience both in and out of the bedroom.
Okay, I am here for this.
Yeah.
But how does having a pleasure practice actually translate into like a better sex life?
Well, when you allow yourself to experience more pleasure in all areas of your life, it naturally spills over into your relationships. You show up with more confidence, more openness, and yeah, even more desire. It's like they're all connected.
That makes so much sense. If you're walking around feeling depleted and disconnected from yourself, how can you possibly expect to connect with someone else on an intimate level? It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
100%. And that's actually where this idea of sexual self-care comes in, recognizing that your sexual well-being is just as important as your physical, mental, and emotional well-being.
Totally. We wouldn't think twice about seeing a doctor if we were experiencing physical pain, right? So why should it be any different when it comes to our sexual health and happiness? We deserve to feel good in all areas of our lives.
You got it. And just like we prioritize things like exercise and healthy eating, we can also choose to prioritize our sexuality. Exploring our desires, understanding our bodies, communicating our needs to our partners, that's all part of taking care of ourselves.
It's about giving ourselves permission to be our full, authentic, and yes, even our erotic selves, embracing pleasure and connection without shame or reservation.
Beautifully said. And you know what? When we do that, when we embrace those parts of ourselves, it opens up a world of possibilities for deeper connection, more intimacy, and yeah, even mind-blowing sex.
Speaking of mind-blowing sex, can we talk about the elephant in the room for a sec? The thing that tends to cause so much anxiety and comparison in relationships, sexual frequency. How much sex is normal? How often are we supposed to be doing it?
The million-dollar question. And thankfully, Kate is here to debunk that myth once and for all. She says that focusing on how much sex you're having or how often you're having it is a total distraction.
So it's not about hitting some magical number.
Absolutely not. It's about quality over quantity. And more importantly, it's about figuring out what feels good and sustainable for you and your partner without comparing yourselves to everyone else.
Because what works for one couple might not work for another couple. And that's totally okay.
Exactly. And the key here is communication. Talking openly and honestly about your needs and desires and recognizing that those needs and desires, they might change over time, and that's okay. It's all about finding your own rhythm as a couple and honoring what feels right for your unique relationship.
It's about tuning out all that outside noise and figuring out what works for you.
Exactly. And, both Jaya and Kate touch upon something that I think can make those conversations about change and evolution feel a little delicate.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Honest.
It's the fear of things changing as we get older. The what if the spark fades conversation.
Oh, the what if the spark fades. conversation. Yeah, that's a big one. It's like this fear that just creeps in, especially as we get older or like, relationships change. You start to wonder if things will ever be as, I don't know, exciting or as fulfilling as they used to be.
Totally. It's super common, that fear of the unknown, like what if things change in ways I'm not going to like? It's bound to come up, especially in long-term relationships.
Right. So how do we deal with those fears in a healthy way? Because like pretending they're not there doesn't seem like a great strategy.
You're definitely right about that. Ignoring those feelings won't make them magically disappear. Both Jaya and Kate talked about how important it is to acknowledge those fears, and this is key, to reframe them as opportunities for growth.
Okay, hold on. I need to hear more about this. Reframing fear as opportunity. How does that even work?
Well, it starts with accepting that change is going to happen, right? Our bodies change, our desires change, and yeah, our sex lives, they're going to change too.
Right. We change jobs, we get new haircuts. Why would we expect our sex lives to stay exactly the same forever?
Exactly. So instead of freaking out about those changes, what if we got curious about them? What if those changes could actually lead us to like even deeper intimacy and connection with our partners?
Okay. Yeah, I can see how that would shift things.
Okay.
So it's about being open to the fact that things will change and choosing to see those changes as a good thing, like maybe even a chance to create something even more fulfilling than what you had before. But how do we actually navigate those changes together with our partner without letting them like drive a wedge between us?
Yep. Such a good question. And it all comes back to, you guessed it, communication. We have to be willing to talk to our partners about those fears, those desires, even those physical changes that we're going through.
Because if we're not talking about it, those anxieties can just fester and grow, right?
Exactly. It's like anything else. It's so much better to bring it out into the open.
Way less scary that way. Yeah. And it's funny because Kate was talking about how relationships naturally go through different stages and phases. Like that honeymoon phase intensity, it's not realistic to expect that to last forever.
Right.
And that's actually kind of a relief to hear.
I think so too.
Because let's be real, no one's having spontaneous sex on the kitchen counter when they're worried about work deadlines and remembering to pack their kids' lunches.
So true. Life happens. But instead of seeing it as this loss or a failure, we can choose to appreciate those different flavors of intimacy that show up as our relationships evolve.
Okay, that is such a good way to look at it. It's like, yeah, maybe the spontaneous sex happens less often, but it's replaced by something more intentional, more mindful, maybe even more deeply connected.
Yes. And having a pleasure practice can really help with that. When we're more in tune with our own bodies and our own desires, we can communicate our needs to our partners more clearly. And then we can co-create experiences that feel good for both of us, even if those experiences look a little different than they used to.
It's about being adaptable and finding those new sparks. Because I'm guessing those new sparks, the ones that come from years of shared history and really knowing each other deeply, those can be even more powerful and fulfilling than that initial spark of a new relationship.
100%.
Wow. Okay, I'm feeling so much better about this whole spark fading thing now.
Yeah.
It's not about trying to get back to something that's gone. It's about creating something new, something that feels even more authentic and meaningful for where you're at now.
That's the goal.
This has been such an amazing conversation. I feel like we've learned so much. We talked about those erotic blueprints, dealing with mismatched libidos, embracing change, communicating better, and even how to reframe those anxieties that pop up around sex and intimacy.
It's been so fun diving into all this juicy stuff with you.
And I think the biggest takeaway from both of these interviews is that there's no one right way to do sex and relationships.
The best way to do it is your way.
Exactly. It's about letting go of all those expectations, those comparisons, those shoulds, and instead choosing curiosity, communication, and most importantly, pleasure.
Yes, to more pleasure.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on. If you could just hit the reset button on everything you think you know about sex and relationships, what kind of intimate life would you create?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Something to think about. Until next time, happy exploring.